Welcome to the Open Loop podcast. It's a podcast exploring the people, companies, and ideas shaping the future of neurotechnology. I'm Chay Carter, the founder of Carter Sciences, Recce Neuro, and the Neurotech newsletter. In each episode, I sit down with founders, operators, researchers, investors, and leaders building the edge of neuroscience, neurotechnology, and healthcare. We'll have honest conversations about people's journeys into the neurotech industry, what they're currently building, how it's going, the realities, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and what the future holds for the neurotech industry in general. Welcome to the latest episode of the Open Loop podcast. I'm joined today by Ken Mariash, the CEO of Sinaptica Therapeutics. Ken, great to have you here. I'd love for you to kick us off by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about Sinaptica, then we'll dive into the weeds shortly.
Great. Hey, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here and share a little bit of our story. I'm Ken. I've been leading the charge at Sinaptica now for about 3 years. My background spans drug development and medical devices. I was at Baxter, did a stint there for quite a while, actually, 8-year stint there in the bioscience unit, and then went to Boston Scientific, where I was head of strategy for the neuromodulation business. I also was the commercial lead for the Cosman franchise, selling RF ablation worldwide. I got the startup bug about 4 years ago, and when I saw the data from Sinaptica's co-founders in Alzheimer's, I thought, wow, this is something really special. My job at Boston Scientific Neuromod was to look at everything in the field of neuromodulation, which is a pretty wide area. And so I'd had my finger on the pulse of the space for quite a while. I do have a previous background of one drug development study that I was a part of in Alzheimer's, and so I kind of knew what to look for. And when I saw the phase 2 data from Sinaptica's co-founders, I was pretty impressed and came aboard based on that about 3 years ago. And since then, we built a great company. We've got patents, we've got a phase 3 plan, we've got a product ready to go, and importantly, moving into pivotal trials now. So an exciting phase for our company's development.
Fantastic. I mean, look, I've got a lot of questions about Sinaptica and the technology and where it's come from different indications over the years to where you are now. But I would love to start with your journey into life sciences because you've got more of a finance background, if that's right.
Well, I have degrees in economics and also biochemistry. Ever since I was a little kid, I wanted to be part of medicine. I wanted to be on the business side. And so it made sense for me to combine a background in biochemistry to know enough about the science with a background in business to be able to put the two together. I started on the drug side, as I said, and I was very excited by some of the product areas that I worked on, including vaccines, hemophilia drugs, intravenous immune globulin, which is a great product for various neurological and primary immune deficiency disorders. Many areas of medicine, biosurgery. What got me really interested in neuromodulation was this idea that you could target the therapy directly to the body's central nervous system or peripheral nervous system and achieve really profound effects with almost no side effects. And furthermore, I really liked the idea that you could personalize the therapy. And where we've seen this area of medicine move is towards more and more refined personalization, closed loop approaches, being able to sense and respond to the body's changes as we stimulate different nerve systems and organ systems to affect diseases. And so being a part of that, I became really enamored in neuromodulation approaches that do take a closed loop approach, which is what we're doing at Sinaptica. But there's many others examples of that in the deep brain stimulation space, for example, and now also in spinal cord stimulation, you see this closed loop approach is starting to take hold and the efficacy improves, the tolerability improves, and over the patient's journey, you're able to adjust the therapy as the patient progresses and changes, which makes all the sense in the world. So yeah, that's kind of what brought me into the neuromodulation side.
I mean, you did 8 years at Boston, strategy and new markets, or head of strategy as well. I mean, what did that role sort of entail? And I think you touched on probably a few technologies there that you pretty worked on, the SCS and DBS space. But tell me a little bit more about that role. That's fascinating. I mean, they're big buyers at the moment, aren't they, Boston? They're involved in a lot of major acquisitions. What was your time there like?
Very acquisitive. So the strategy group, I actually founded the group. Our job was to do obviously strategic planning. So normally you take a 3-year horizon, sometimes 5 years if you're going to look a little bit farther into the future. We also took a look at the 1-year operating plan and worked with our finance colleagues in terms of planning the next years of operations. But it's really a long-term strategy role. It looks at different opportunities for the division to grow. How do we want to grow? Where do we want to grow? What are the core competencies we want to build? How do we want to succeed and be successful relative to competition, relative to the opportunities available to us? And one of the constant tensions that we grappled with was in my particular position at Boston Scientific was, are we a neuromod company or are we a pain company? So there's sort of two axes of strategy, if you will, that you could expand along. And so we wrestled with that question many times and ultimately made the decision that we were a pain company, and so we could go beyond neuromodulation. And so we did. We acquired Vertiflex, but there's always been obviously a strong bias toward neuromodulation approaches. So my group helped frame that sort of strategic expansion. We also did acquisition assessments, and so working with our BD colleagues, we would look at a whole space and we would say, is this a space that we think makes sense for us to compete in? If so, how? Who are the targets within that space? How should we think about them? How might they be a fit for our commercial capabilities, our technical competencies, our clinical competencies as well? So we would do the assessment of multiple acquisition targets within a space often, and then we would go after systematically each of those. A perfect example was RF ablation, where we did the deal to acquire Cosman. We did a lot of assessment on the RF ablation space as a whole. What are the macro pieces that make it an attractive market? Why is it a good fit? Where could we compete and how? And then we marched down the list of acquisition targets and ultimately ended with acquiring Cosman. And then, there really was very few people who knew the business as well as we did. And so I got tapped to be the commercial lead for that franchise after it was acquired and integrated. So that was the fun piece of the role. That made me transition from a strategic kind of mandate to now having a dual mandate as being a commercial lead of a franchise selling in 40 countries, as well as having the 50,000-foot view on strategy for the whole division. And so that was a nice expansion of my role that I'm really grateful I had the opportunity to be a part of, because it exposed me to a lot of the tactics, the opposite of strategy, the day-to-day tactics of actually selling, commercializing, and supporting a business worldwide. So glad to have that kind of added to my resume, which actually made me a lot more, I think, cognizant of what it actually takes to scale a piece of capital equipment, which then, of course, brought me to Sinaptica, where our challenge is taking a piece of capital equipment for brain stimulation now in Alzheimer's and scaling that worldwide too.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I think you've really led the way for a lot of Boston Scientific's more recent expansion, probably since you left as well. There's a lot's happened across neurology and pain, and a lot of acquisitions
Mhm.
have happened in that space. So kudos to you for that. But yeah, let's jump into Synaptica. I mean,
Mhm.
tell me about the technology then from a 50,000-foot view. What is the technology? What's the main vision here for how it's supposed to work with the patient population? Then we can get into the weeds.
Okay, well, let's start with the premise of what is the disease of Alzheimer's. And so for 20 years, or you could even say for 100 years since Alois Alzheimer discovered these amyloid plaques under microscope, for the last 20 years at least with drug development, we've been very focused as an industry on amyloid plaques. And there have been various therapeutics in development to target those amyloid plaques at various stages as they come together through various means, mainly monoclonal antibodies. And now, finally, we do have two drugs that are approved that they do a terrific job of cleaning up amyloid, and yet the disease continues. So, with the kind of marginal success of those drugs, the industry has now sort of finally come to the conclusion that amyloid is not the be all end all. It's not the complete picture. Does it help to clear amyloid? Yes. Does that compound the disease? Yes. So there is a place for these drugs to play in clearing amyloid plaques, but ultimately it doesn't address the root of the disease. So the industry now is starting to look at the disease in different ways. There's other focuses now on tau, for example, as another target. There's microglial dysfunction, which is another approach. Neuroinflammation is kind of a key area of focus for some of the drugs in development. Our approach is a little bit different. We're starting to see that Alzheimer's is a disease of network dysfunction. Now, when you start to think about a disease in that light, you start to appreciate the complexity, the multi-facet nature of a disease. If it's a large system, you can start to appreciate that it will require stabilization at a network level. Let me say it another way. So we think about heart disease, right? There's no one cause of heart disease. There's many different contributing factors to heart disease. The heart, the circulatory system, is a system, a complex system with many interacting pieces. Any one of those pieces, if they are dysfunctional, can have effects throughout the entire system. If we think of the network that drives human memory, that is the default mode network. That's the technical term for it. If we think of that network as being out of whack, there's excitation, inhibition imbalances in that network. There's disconnection. There's oscillatory imbalances in the network in the Alzheimer's brain. Then we start to appreciate, this requires an intervention at the network level. So enter neuromodulation.
Yeah.
Neuromodulation has the ability, when targeted to the right network, to be able to strengthen and stabilize that network. Just like a pacemaker, for example, you can imagine is focused on pacing the entire circulatory system. You can imagine the stimulation delivered to the DMN is, in a sense, strengthening and stabilizing that network. It does this through the enhancement of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's mechanism for encoding memory. That's really the definition of memory is a plastic response to stimulus. If we can potentiate LTP plasticity in particular, maybe we can correct the signaling imbalance in the first place. That was the root hypothesis behind Sinaptica's founding. And so the key then is, how do we deliver the stimulation to the right areas in the brain? TMS has been around for a long time. It's an exciting technology. It's focal, it's powerful, but essentially it's shooting in the dark. There's no way to confirm, the way the technology is today, which networks are actually stimulating. Also, setting the dose is an exercise in guesswork. You really don't know what dose to set. You can literally use a rule of thumb. It literally is a thumb twitch to set the dose. But the thumb twitch, meaning the motor excitability, has nothing to do with the cortical excitability in the brain. So there's really no way to set the dose with TMS as it is today. Now we're changing all that. We're combining TMS with EEG. When you do that, you have the ability now, as we do, to pulse the brain with single pulses of energy and then listen with 64-channel EEG to see where the evoked potentials travel in the brain. The analogy might be spinal cord stimulation, where we're starting to sense and respond to ECAPs. That's a relatively straightforward technical challenge because ECAPs are a simple wave going in a linear fashion down the spinal cord, up the spinal cord. Here, we're looking for those evoked potentials traveling in 3D space throughout an enormously complex network. And it's not like they just radiate out. They radiate out and then bounce back. And so there's a very complex perturbation of a complex system when you send single pulses of energy. That is the data that we have learned how to deconstruct and decode. We can decode that data from TMS EEG as a way to confirm, yes, we're hitting the right network. And then secondly, we can also set a safe but effective dose based on how strong those evoked potentials are. We don't want to exceed a certain threshold, but we also don't want to deliver underpowered stimulation either. So we set a safe but effective dose that's unique for every individual. So this is a really powerful technology that's taking TMS out of the dark ages, combining it with very complex signal processing in order to exquisitely tailor that therapy for every patient's brain. It turns out every brain responds differently. I mean, for you, the stimulation point might be centimeters away from where it is for me. For you, the dose might be twice what it is for me. So we personalize all that. And that's what we think has been responsible for our phase 2 data that has been, it's strange to say, 100% successful. What does it mean to have 100% successful phase 2 data? It means we hit the primary endpoint, gold standard measures of dementia, and all key secondaries, both at 6 months and at 12 months in a rigorous randomized controlled fashion. That's phenomenal. That's very exciting. It's an outstanding result, published in top journals, presented from the top conferences, stages, by our scientific co-founders. And so, again, just to put a bow on it, it all comes down to personalization and precision. Knowing where to stimulate, at what dose, is what we believe is the key to unlocking the spectacular efficacy that we've seen in our phase 2 trial.
Amazing. I mean, yeah, that the data from the trials is almost like too good to be true, isn't it? It's almost like worrying. People
You're not
won't
the
believe
first
it.
to say that.
Yeah. I mean, look, also as well, like TMS is a technology that's been around for a while. I was lucky enough recently to sit down with Owen Muir from Radial and talk about the mental health treatments through TMS. And a lot of the feedback I get from people is that the mental health treatments of TMS are long programs in clinics. It's difficult to get people to commit. There's obviously lots of innovation happening in the space. There's deep TMS now, I think, from the guys at Brainsway, and Neuronetics have been accumulating data for ages and expanding their indications. But there's companies like Amper doing 1-day treatments, Magnus, and so forth. But yours is probably the first that's taking this technology and doing something completely different with it. I mean, what does the program look like? How many treatments does it look like? And how does the technology, because I know there's lots of different types of TMS, sort of coiled treatments there and pulse treatments that are different for every single company.
I wish I had some visuals, but imagine a patient wearing a 64-channel EEG cap. So they wear this cap only once every time we do calibration, so at baseline and then every 3 months thereafter. We stimulate over the cap. So getting the hardware to work together is a little bit tricky because the stimulator is putting out hundreds of volts per meter, and then the cap is listening, so to speak, at microvolts. So you have several orders of magnitude difference in energy output. And so getting the hardware components to work together is the first challenge. We've mastered that, working with our hardware partner, Nexstim in this case. Secondly is, what do you do with that data? So let's say you get the hardware to work together. That's the first challenge. Then you're generating lots of data. This is very complex data from every brain. It's about 9 gigabytes of calibration data. But we know how to parse that data and, importantly, how to remove many artifacts. Artifacts can range from blinking to head movements to startle responses. There's also noise in the line. And the blast of energy from the TMS coil itself is an enormous artifact that we know how to remove from the data. Once we have clean data, you can imagine there's a lot of signal processing that goes to work to look at the right features to confirm target engagement. And we've used machine learning derived algorithms to do so. It's very complex signal processing. Anyway, what that looks for the patient is they come in for this 45-minute calibration procedure at baseline. They have an MRI already, most of them. We load that into the machine. We do a survey of 9 areas over the precuneus, which is our key target in the posterior parietal cortex. The precuneus is a rather large space. We do a survey of 9 different points that are specific for every individual, and one of those points is going to end up being the right point, but we don't know which. We upload all that data into the cloud. It takes about 2.5 hours for our cloud-based algorithms to run and parse the data, and then voila, the machine spits out our prescription for that patient. They come back the next day, usually it's the next day or the next week, and then it's just 20 minutes a week. 20 minutes a week, chronic therapy, as long as you come in, lean back in a recliner, keep your eyes open if you want, talk to the technician if you want, totally painless therapy. The most that could happen to the patient, or I should say the worst that could happen to the patient, is a mild headache in about 10% of patients that spontaneously resolves. Small price to pay for preserving every memory you've ever had and the health of your brain itself. So weekly stimulation as long as they can come in. Now, we do recalibration, and we believe that's going to be about every 3 months. The recalibration not only will adjust the dose, remember these patients' brains are changing and responding and atrophying over time. We can change the dose over time, but we'll also have a built-in readout of whether or not your brain is responding. This is the most exciting piece of our therapy, I think, is the ability to tell you, yes, your default mode network is responding to this therapy. It's on a very nice, even trajectory, and therefore you can go to bed, we can tell the patient tonight, confident that this therapy is working for you and your DMN is stabilized, or not, as the case may be, and then maybe, get out a drug or change the regimen or something. But for 68% of the patients in our first phase 2, they were responders to this therapy. To be able to communicate to the caregiver too, that your efforts are not in vain, that bringing this patient in for weekly therapy is actually preserving the very network that drives their human memory, that's golden. Now, with our new reimbursement codes, they'll be able to charge for that too. So not only can we hand the patient a report that says this thing is working, not only can we adjust the dose, but we can also give the physician some reason to do this therapy that gets them paid for it as well. So there's an economic incentive as well. And the therapy will also have a reimbursement code, which was granted as of earlier this year for the therapy itself. And so, in the case of the drugs, there is no readout whether or not it's working. You don't know. You're doing biweekly infusions for 90 minutes every 2 weeks. You have no idea. You hope that it's working, but you have no idea that it's actually working for you. You could do a cognitive test, of course. You could see if there are markers of clinical progression, but you have no biomarker necessarily of response. You can even measure amyloid levels with the drugs, and you could see those amyloid levels coming down. Great. What does that tell you about clinical progression? Not that much, because it turns out amyloid levels are not that well correlated with clinical measures of dementia. Ours is. So that's a long way of saying we have something here that is exquisitely personalized for every patient. It is a biomarker-led journey from start to finish and every place in between that gives the patient enormous confidence that it's working and has enormous economic incentives all the way around.
Yeah, we're seeing more and more neurotechnology these days being focused, well, obviously EEG and machine learning driven in order to kind of make sense of the noise that we're recording in our brains. And I think combining it with something like TMS is fantastic. There are companies out there like Beacon Biosignals who are using it in collaboration with pharmaceutical drug trials. Great. But still, I think being able to record the neurotechnology piece, and this is what it always comes down to. I think neurodegenerative and Alzheimer's is a very unique position because the drugs often, the efficacy is pretty terrible, really. I think the stats speak for themselves. So it's able to record neurotechnology, and I guess the end goal here is like, how does neurotech or Sinaptica specifically become the first choice for patients with with Alzheimer's, with symptoms of Alzheimer's? And I guess it comes down to a market access, because I think there's a lot of education around neurotechnology, and that needs to happen. That is starting to happen. I feel like the last couple of years have been a huge turning point for the industry as a whole as it becomes more acceptable. I mean, neuromodulation, spinal cord stimulation still sounds like sci-fi to people who don't know what it is, let alone DBS, let alone signal processing and BCI. But for you guys to get to that point where you're the first option for people, obviously it comes down to access and scaling as well, right? I mean, you mentioned market access and then reimbursement. Tell me a bit more about that and what that process has been like for something so unique.
Well, I think the key is obviously it has to work, and then the reimbursement has to be in place, and it has to be something that's scalable, meaning that technicians can learn how to do it and can deploy it without too much training. In all those cases, the answer is yes. In our case, we have the reimbursement codes that could pay very well. Some comparisons would be about $20,000 a year for the kind of reimbursement codes that we have, which is more than enough to build a great business on, both for the neurologist, who, remember, they don't make anything on the drugs, but also for Sinaptica, obviously. So an enormous new revenue center. We've also done a lot of work to perfect the software to be workflow driven, graphical user interface, point and click simplicity, where the system really tells the technician what to do. We don't rely on the technician to interpret any data. That's a big statement I just made, because the data is incredibly complex. We simply send the data to our cloud-based algorithms, where a 14-step process goes to work to tell the technician, you aim here at this dose. That's all. A simple report that says, this is where you stimulate at this dose for this patient, and then it's 20 minutes a week thereafter. So that's scalable. And it's not as if TMS hasn't been scaled. It has. It is available in many countries, too many to count at this point. TMS is well established for depression. Depression, on the other hand, is a terrible market. The patient, by definition, is not motivated. In the case of Alzheimer's, the caregivers and the patient are enormously motivated. Secondly, the customer, the physician. In the case of depression, it's a psychiatrist whose favorite medical device is this to write a prescription with. They're not familiar with big pieces of capital equipment. A neurologist is. They do EEGs all day long. For them, this is simple addition to their repertoire. The other point I would make is that depression is a second line, if not third line treatment, meaning TMS. In our case, it'll be first line. So your question was, how do we make this the first option? It's evident whenever we talk to a KOL that they will reach for this first. Given the effects are 82% slowing at 24 weeks, let me put that into context. For the drugs, it's about 27% slowing at 18 months. So we're showing much better efficacy in a wide range of patients and then with almost no side effects. So given the benefit to risk ratio there, it's clear that physicians will reach for stimulation first once we overcome all of the usual challenges about how does it work and can I make money with it and can I get patients in and out. It'll be clear, I think, based on the efficacy and the safety profile and the wide label that this makes sense to prescribe first. Not only that, but the mode of action is synergistic with drugs. So there's always talk about combining drugs in Alzheimer's now. 2 drugs together is really almost like a 3-body problem. It's almost unsolvable because you have all of these different side effects from each of the drugs, which compound each other and become entangled. Parsing that in a clinical trial is very difficult. But if you take our stimulation as the substrate, really, to build a drug on, to add a drug on top of, that makes all the sense in the world because you have something that has almost no downside. Start with that, strengthen the DMN, reduce the rate of decline, add a drug on top, and maybe you get 1 + 1 = 3, 4, or 5. We will see what the combination potential is, but everyone agrees. Theoretically, it's there. The question is what combinations, when, at what stage, and our ability to monitor patients with our therapy should provide enormous insights also into what drugs make the most sense to combine with our therapy because we'll be tracking these patients, we'll be collecting outcomes, and we'll be measuring the impact of different combinations over time on the actual biology that drives human memory, that is the DMN. So anyway, just long way of saying start with stimulation, add a drug on top. That's the most likely way that we fit into the continuum.
Yeah, I know you've already got the advantage of having the EEG component built into it too, as you're already, understanding what's going on after each stimulation session. And now adding drugs on top of that, you can monitor it in real time too on a weekly basis. So you've already kind of tackled that. I mean, what does the hardware look like for a neurologist if they wanted to get involved in this? What would that look like? What would they need to acquire? What do they currently already have that it could be used, or is it a whole new piece of hardware?
Yeah, it's a whole new integrated system. Getting the EEG integrated to work with the TMS is key. Getting the neuronavigation to work seamlessly is also another key. And then getting the data connectivity to the cloud is another piece of the equation that we're solving. So yes, it's one piece of hardware. It shouldn't be that big of a lift for neurologists. They already buy capital equipment, whether it's doing, EEGs in a passive way, nerve conduction studies, et cetera. A lot of neurologists now are becoming more entrepreneurial. The bigger groups now, they own their own MRIs, they have their own sleep labs. Some of them focus on, epilepsy, et cetera. So there's an appetite for new sources of revenue, and there's not many of them. And we are definitely that in spades. And so, yeah, it's a piece of capital equipment, but it pays for itself in 18 months. It's not that hard to use. Again, it's been already scaled in TMS for depression. The only pieces we're adding is the neuronavigation, the personalization, and the cloud connectivity. And so, we don't believe it's a huge lift. And remember, these patients have no other option. They've been handed a death sentence. I hate to say it like that, but that's what this is. And I've seen it up close many times now, including members of my own family. They have no option. And so in the absence of other viable options, to be able to now offer something to your patients, remember the drugs aren't labeled for moderate disease. They only seem to work, and then only marginally, in MCI, so-called mild cognitive impairment, and mild Alzheimer's. They are not labeled in moderate, and they have all kinds of other contraindications from ApoE4 status to anticoagulant use. So here we have a broad label with very few restrictions that goes into moderate population as well and shows enormous efficacy in those moderates. We are the only hope for those patients at present. Maybe in the future there will be other therapies for moderates, but we don't see any drugs in development that look that promising, especially not in moderates.
No, look, I think obviously we're probably both a little biased here with the neurotech and neuromod focus, but I do think there is, there's decades of research into neuromodulation and with deep brain stimulation, for instance. And then I think the goal always, and the natural progression with neurotech always seems to be like, let's improve that patient experience.
Mm.
Implantable devices are for extreme cases, and yes, they will always have a place in the community and the patient population. But the reality is, keeping people out of, out from under the knife, I suppose, is the key. And this is something that's really unique. And I think what's so beautiful about neurotech often is that these technologies have existed for a really long time. This takes some adoption and some expansion of indications. And you guys seem to have done something really, really special there. I mean, what does the short, medium, and long term look like for you guys now? What's the rest of this year look like? What are the next steps for you about getting this, readily available for more people?
So we are now recruiting sites for our pivotal study. We've got a number of highly reputable sites already signed up. We're planning to place one of our first machines in July at a site in Florida, actually. So we'll be able to start recruiting early just in July. That's only 2 months away. Actually, one
Wow.
month, if you think about it.
Yeah.
So this is happening. Gosh, they're so excited to get their hands on this technology. Um, the next step will be enrolling that pivotal study. Should enroll pretty easily, given it's a non-invasive. There's not a lot of side effects that the patient has to worry about. The pivotal trial will have a 6-month endpoint, which is relatively fast. So we're not going to keep patients on placebo for 18 months. The endpoint, by the way, is the IDERIS endpoint that's been negotiated with FDA. IDERIS is a global, well-established measure of dementia where we actually showed 102% slowing. In air quotes. 102% slowing means we stop the disease based on that endpoint at 24 weeks. So it's our best endpoint, and that's what we're going forward on with the agency's recommendation there. So excited to pursue that pivotal study. That'll take a while to enroll, and then it's wait for the data. Meanwhile, it'll be improve the algorithms. And then the longer term vision would be, let's make this exquisitely personalized, right? So let's launch with weekly stimulation, for example, and then maybe there's a way to predict, there probably is a way to predict who needs it just every 2 weeks. Can we stretch it to every 2 weeks? Maybe we can go every 3 weeks for certain patients. Really depends on a lot of factors, which we will be keeping track of and being able to use machine learning on those patient outcome data. We should be able to deduce things like that to exquisitely personalize. And then you start thinking about, okay, the long-term potential. You start thinking about, how do we solve the last mile challenges? Maybe patients don't want to come in for therapy. Fine. You can put it in a mobile unit. You can send it to them. Maybe patients at a nursing home don't want to get on a bus and come in for therapy. Fine. We'll place one of our devices at the assisted living facility. There's lots of ways to solve the last mile challenges. And then, and I'll just say this just as a speculation, perhaps there's a pathway to an implant. I come from the world of implants. It's not unthinkable that we could, either partner with or develop an implant of our own. That's one way to do it. On the other hand, there's a 95% chance that most patients will reject an implant. And so, but for that 5% of patients that are open to that kind of a possibility, maybe that's one of the end games for us. But we're going to bring this to the last mile and solve that last mile challenge one way or the other, and bring this therapy widely to a very broad population.
It's interesting about the implantable stuff. There's so much talk about sort of form factor in neurotech,
Mm.
right? About like, how do we miniaturize it, make it portable, wearable, take home, whatever you want to call it. We're
Mm.
seeing that in the mental health space now with like neurostimulators that have just got FDA approval, still not on market, but will be soon. There are, mild neurostimulators for sleep that you could probably buy on Amazon right now, vagus nerve stimulators, for instance. But I do think, and there's some companies out there, and the names escape me, but they're sort of like above the skull, under the skin, mild neurostimulator, BCI slash
Mm.
TMS devices. And I think again, like the hardware is only going to improve, right? It's only going to get smaller and more accurate. And I think the eruption of machine learning and EEG technology obviously going hand in hand together, and that becoming smaller and more portable is only going to make this stuff more accessible to people. So yeah, I think there's like a shift happening too with sort of implantables and neurostimulation devices and becoming more normal. It's still very early days. Again, we're in a bubble, but I think the end of this year we're probably going to see, I think, some different type
Right.
of devices that are more accessible to people, and hopefully, you guys are leading the way there. So thank you very much, Ken. Absolute pleasure.
No, I agree with your closing comments there. And we would say that that seems to be the way things are going, is less and less invasive, more and more personalized, tunable to the patient's brain and adjustable over time. That closed loop approach seems to be the way a lot of areas in neurotech are going. And form factor, does matter if we're going to go to implants, the least invasive implant possible. Fundamentally, we believe that our therapy can stand alone as a non-invasive, but maybe when paired with some of the invasives, it could have even more potential. We'll see. And the drug combinations too, don't forget, I think could be really
Yeah.
synergistic as well. So yeah, I'm excited about where this whole field is going. And I think we're on the cusp of some really big mega trends here. And we eventually hope to make this EKG of the brain, as we call it, just as widespread as an EKG of the heart, to measure the actual health of the very network that drives human memory, which, remember, is most affected by Alzheimer's. So again, we come back to this concept of like biomarker-led medicine, not shooting in the dark, not guessing at the dose, but really knowing exactly where to stimulate at exactly the right dose, being able to adjust that dose over time, and to tell the patient that, yes, you're responding over time, is the very definition of precision medicine. This is precision medicine at a connectome level. And I guess I can leave you on that note.
Fantastic. Where can people find out more about Sinaptica? What's the website?
Sinapticatx.com.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ken. It's been an absolute pleasure. I look forward to seeing what feedback we get on this.
Thanks so much for having me.
This podcast is brought to you by Carter Sciences, the headhunting practice that covers not only headhunting, but also fractional talent work for startups who need help, but don't want to spend those big recruitment fees, wanting to work on a more hourly basis with companies, and also career coaching for neurotech professionals. Goal is to provide cost-effective solutions across all neurotech hiring needs.